Okay, so we've had this prospective observational multi-center study going on for more years than we'd like to try and get to 100 patients, but we are increasing our enrollment. So I'll give you an update as I do every year here. So we have 25 sites in this study, almost all from North America. 19 sites have enrolled at least one case. The data I'm showing is from 60 patients, but we actually have 64 as of a day or two ago. And these are the sites that have enrolled and how many. So the age range is from 4 to 87. We only have 7 pediatric patients, so that's actually a significant increase since a year ago. 2/3 are female. Median age is 39 years. 41% of the whole group qualified as priors, meaning they had prior febrile illness between 1 day and 2 weeks prior. And that was 6 out of 7 pediatric cases and 18 out of 51 adults. As far as etiologies, 80% are cryptogenic in this series. And you can see the diagnoses here. NMDA receptor is by far the leading one, and then a smattering of other things. But strikingly absent is the voltage-gated potassium channel complex, which was actually tied for #1 in our old retrospective series, but seems to be absent in this series. Optimistically, it's because we're identifying it much earlier before they go into status, but I don't actually know. And then in pediatrics, of the 6 we have data on, they're all cryptogenic. Also not too surprising. As far as treatment, this has also changed over time where immunotherapy is given to the vast majority, not quite all of them. It started an average of 6 days after status onset, which still might sound a little late compared to our recommendations, but it's still much earlier than when we looked several years ago. And then the treatments are changing too. I think 2 years ago, we had a total of 1 anakinra tocilizumab, and now there's 12 if you combine those. So those are becoming much more widely used. As far as outcomes, no big surprises here. The mortality is still very high at 27% during hospitalization. And long-term follow-up, 1 year, guess what I'd point out is that 9 of the patients did very well. So that's 9 out of 51, if you count everyone who started. So it's about 18% who do very well. We're going to go until we have at least 100 patients and until we get at least 25 pediatric cases. So we're actually encouraging the pediatric ones now because they're farther behind. And we will also be folding analysis of all the samples we gathered into our new Norse virus biorepository, which I will now tell you about. So this started in the interim since our last roundtable. The objectives of the biorepository to be able to take samples from anywhere in the world without them needing IRB or contracts or anything. So we want to be able to collect them, analyze them in a standard way, store them, and then share whatever is left over after the basic analyses. And this should be done in a two-way sharing. So we take all these samples, we put it into a database, and we make all that available to researchers who request it. If we give samples to people for their studies, we also require that they give us the results back to go into the shared database. And also we're creating these standardized operating procedures. Actually, we hope to publish that very soon. And that will be talking about the best ways of collecting, storing, and analyzing samples so that we can have matching repositories in other places, other continents and countries, but use the exact same procedures in the same database. Practical things, we will get the consent remotely at any of these centers who want to send samples to the biorepository. And we'll send shipping materials, we'll pay for the shipping, and we'll database everything. There's still some work on the other end. You got to help us, give the forms to patients and help with preparing materials for shipping. But we will take care of all the all the costs. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but this is the standard testing that's being done on all of the samples sent to the biorepository. So in the blood, it's autoantibody testing, and through Mike Wilson at UCSF, it's whole genome sequencing, cytokine analyses, and then in a select number, it's some single cell RNA sequencing. And the CSF, similar autoantibody testing and metagenomics through UCSF, cytokine analyses, RNA sequencing in a few cases. And then we're also taking any brain tissue from biopsy or from autopsy. And we have funding for RNA sequencing on a few of those as well. And then the rest we're collecting, but not doing any analyses on. And as far as clinical data, it's basically a 1.5-page form of required data, and then we will get follow-up, and we'll try and get more information, including MRI images and EEGs when we can. And this is the latest update. Thanks to David Stromkov in the back for giving me the updated numbers a day or two ago. So this is what we have right now in the biorepository. This is the number of patients. We actually have more samples because some of them have multiple samples, but you can see the types of samples and how many we have so far. I did want to remind everybody about the Norse Institute website and all the resources on there. Some new things are links to the recordings of our last scientific symposium family conference. So those are online events we've done twice. There's downloadable brochure on Norse. There's a brand new podcast where Ronny Wickström was interviewed about the recent papers and the results of the Delphi. And then these are all the things that have been on there for a while, and several of them are routinely updated, especially the annotated references. And you can see some of the people who helped with that, especially Zubaydah Sheikh has been maintaining it on a very regular basis. And I'll do some of my thank yous now, so I don't forget, but the biggest one is to Nora Wong, who's been the executive director of the Norse Institute. She's sitting up here for those of you who haven't met her. But she's been our fearless leader and big motivating force for virtually everything you'll hear about. The other people on the left side of the slide are the Yale research staff who've been helping, and several of them are in the back. And then some other key people and key friends of the Norse Institute listed here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Teneille Gofton to give an update on the family registry. So Teneille's the director of neurocritical care at Western University in London, Ontario. And she's been running the family registry. You need to use the arrows, just click if you want to point, use the mouse.
Okay, thanks for having me here today. So I'll be brief, updating you on the Norse Family Registry, because I think a lot of you are already aware of it. But if you're not aware of it, there's a poster up here I'll refer you to later. So this is a project I've been working on since about 2019 with several of the people up here on the page. And it's been very generously supported by the Robert N. Cohn Norse Family Registry Memorial Research Fund, and we're very grateful for that funding. So essentially, how does the Norse and Fires Family Registry work? It's available anywhere in the world. You can access the internet. Survivors of Norse or fires, their family members, or their physicians or doctors can enter data directly into the registry as long as there's consent on the physician side. And it's available right now in English, French, and Spanish, and we're working on Hindi and Portuguese and a few other languages under development right now to make it as accessible internationally as possible. We also do have it available in simple Chinese characters at this stage. So what happens basically is it's a REDCap database, and survivors or their surrogates can go, and there's a consent form on the first page of the database, or their healthcare team can go. You don't have to be institutionally authorized to do it. There's specific information for healthcare providers on the website with regards to consent and how to document it. So very briefly, just our current participation from about a month ago is that we have 69 participants, and those are 47% female and the other half are male. They're a broad age range all the way from young to older ages, but obviously our overwhelming group here is those who have I can't see them right now. Anyway, those who are between 0 and 9 years old are overwhelmingly participants, but we do also have many up until about age 29 as the majority. And if you look at all of our participants, almost half, but not quite, are adults, and 59% are pediatric. So on the left here is a graph just representing the symptoms prior to seizure onset. And the most common one is fever, but many people don't necessarily have fever, have headache, flu-like illness, and fatigue or GI infection or others. In the middle is a representation of how many participants in the entire registry, so adults and pediatrics, had a presentation consistent with fires. And as you can see, that's actually a high number at 71%, which is consistent with what Larry was just telling us about. And if you want more information on that, you can come to the poster tomorrow. The vast majority of our participants at this stage are from the USA, but we do have participants from all over. So tomorrow, please visit our poster. In the interest of being brief, I have a poster over there from the Status Epilepticus Colloquium earlier this year, if anybody wants to go see it. Our poster tomorrow will be from 12 till noon in the poster hall, and I have cards at the front and at the back. So if anybody can take those, give them out to families, give them out to colleagues to promote the registry and increase our participation, that would be fantastic. I just how to access the registry. The QR code is on the cards also, but that's the easiest and most straightforward way to go. You can contact Carney, who's our research coordinator, or myself with any questions about the registry. Thanks so much. Your agenda.
Okay, thank you, Teneille. We're now going to move on to our hot topics data blitz. So each presentation has 7 minutes, and then we have 3.5 minutes for discussion. So the first one is going to be on serum and CSF cytokine analysis. It's by Aurélie Hanin, who's a postdoctoral research associate at Yale, and she also works at Salpêtrière in Paris. Aurélie?
This one.
So you up and down if you want.
Okay, so hello everyone. So thanks Dr. Hirsch and Nora Wong for giving me the opportunity to present today the result of a study investigating the cytokine chemokine profile in patients with status new onset refractory status epilepticus. So we know that several arguments suggest now that Norse is a disorder of immunity leading to exacerbated cerebral inflammation. First, patients with Norse that frequently have CSF with myelofibrosis and mildly elevated protein level upon admission. Polymorphism in cytokine-related genes were also found in patients with fires, the subtypes of Norse preceded with fever, and increased serum or CSF cytokine levels are reported in small cohort of patients with Norse and fires. Consequently, patients with Norse are often treated empirically with immunotherapy in order to manage its suspecting underlying inflammation mechanisms and hopefully minimize sequelae. The recent consensus recommendations suggest to use a first-line immunotherapy within 72 hours of the onset of the refractory status, and a second-line immunotherapy that could be an anakinra or tocilizumab within 1 week in cryptogenic mouse. Nonetheless, no study supports the use of any specific treatment in cryptogenic mouse, and no study has evaluated the correlation between the cytokine chemokine profile and patients' outcome. So in our study, we are investigating inflammation using a cohort of 61 patients with Norse, mostly adults, and including 51 with a cryptogenic Norse. We have compared the cytokine profile to 37 patients with other form of refractory status and 52 control patients. For this study, 12 cytokine or chemokine were measured in the serum of all patients and CSF from some, with a multiplex fluorescent bead-based immunoassay detection. We have first investigated the cytokine profile between patients with status, Norse or other forms, and patients without status. We found that patients with status had a significant increase of the serum innate immunity pro-inflammatory cytokines, specifically the interleukin 6, interleukin 8 or 6CL8, MIP1 alpha, and CCL2. We also found a significant increase of the T-cell associated cytokines, either the pro-inflammatory, like the IL-12 P70, or the anti-inflammatory IL-10. However, we did not find any statistically significant differences for serum IL-1 beta. In the CSF, we observed also an elevation of the innate immunity pro-inflammatory cytokines, but there was no differences for the T-cell associated cytokines or IL-1 beta. We next compare the cytokine profile between the 51 patients with a cryptogenic Norse and the 47 with a non-cryptogenic refractory status, Norse or other forms. We have found that patients with a cryptogenic Norse had a significant increase of the serum innate immunity pro-inflammatory cytokines compared to non-cryptogenic cases, and specifically for the interleukin-8, MIP-1 alpha, and CCL2. However, in the CSF, no statistically significant differences were observed. Those results seems to highlight the involvement of the innate immunity in the pathophysiological mechanisms of Norse. But we wondered if innate immunity was also able to predict patients' outcome. Among a cohort of 61 patients with Norse, we had 24 patients with the fires, including 21 adults. So as I said before, an etiology was found for 10 patients. And we had 22% of patients who expired during hospitalization and 57 who had a severe disability at discharge.
Qu'est-ce que t'as, la doudoune?
We are fully dependent, 14 had a moderate disability, and 34 just a lower disability or full recovery. We look at the correlation between the clinical data and biological data with a matrix, where a positive correlation is highlighted by a red color, like between the pro-inflammatory cytokine with each other, and a negative correlation is highlighted by a blue color, like between interleukin-4 and the age. We found that older patients presented more frequently with a non-convulsive status, had elevated serum interleukin-8 levels, and a worse outcome highlighted by a lower Glasgow score, both at discharge and during the follow-up. Patients with fires were more frequently younger, 34-year-old compared to 49, with a convulsive status epilepticus, and they were likely to develop the post-Norse epilepsy in 80% of cases. We observed that patients who had elevated serum interleukin-6, 8, CCL2, and MIP-1 alpha during status had a worse outcome at hospital discharge, and patients who had elevated serum IL-6, 8, and CCL2 had a worse outcome several months after status epilepticus ending. We have performed the same analysis in the CSF, and we found that patients who had elevated CSF and MIP-1 alpha levels had a worse outcome at discharge, and patients with elevated IL-6, CCL2, and MIP-1 alpha levels had a worse outcome several months after status epilepticus ended. In contrast, we did not find any correlation between the serum cytokine and patients' outcome for those with other forms of status epilepticus. So as a conclusion, we found significant differences in serum and CSF cytokine chemokine profile between patients with status and patients without status. So changes can be explained by the activated glial cells and blood-brain barrier leakage within minutes after status onset, or by the production of cytokines by peripheral leukocytes. We found an elevation of the serum innate immunity pro-inflammatory cytokines in patients with a cryptogenic Norse compared to non-cryptogenic refractory status. We also found that this innate immunity was associated with a Norse outcome at both short-term and long-term. So our data suggest an involvement of the peripheral inflammation in Norse pathophysiology and consequences, and the importance of utilizing specific anti-inflammatory interventions that could be also anti-IL-8 therapy in patients with cryptogenic Norse. So we will pursue this project by measuring prospectively the cytokine chemokine profile for the new patient enrolled in the Biorepository, and we would like also to focus more on the serial serum cytokine level and to evaluate the data according to the treatment used and patient's condition. So I just would like to conclude by thanking all the people who were involved in this project, both at the Yale University School of Medicine and in the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris. Thank you for your attention.
Great, we have time for a couple of questions, including anyone on Zoom. You can either raise your hand or type in the chat. Dr. Koh.
Excuse me, could you?
Was
Yes.
sampling done at the same time?
Yeah. We have looked at
Could you repeat the question?
you have between the months.
Oh, yeah, the question was sampling done at a uniform time point?
All the samples were not drawn at the same time point, unfortunately, but we have a look at the correlation between the delay between status onset and sample collection and the level of the cytokines either in the blood and in the CSF, and we did not find any statistically significant correlation.
What about simple changes from that patient?
Yeah, the time points that were getting later, and are there simple changes?
Serial samples.
Yeah. We have the
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question was just to look at the serial sample. So for the new Biorepository and Norse fires, we're able to collect samples at day 1, day 2, day 8, and 28 after patient enrollment. So it will be very interesting to look at those data. Currently, we are just data from around 10, 12 patients with the serial measurements. So we have begun to look at those at the evolution of the cytokine levels. But I think we need also to take into account the change in the treatments used, the change also for the peripheral cytokines of the complications that patient may occur during the ICU stay. So yeah, it's something really important to do. For this study, we just take for the analysis the first sample for the patients.
Dr. Hafler, you have your hand raised.
I have my hand up, yes. Wonderful presentation. So when we're looking at these data the other day, what really struck me about it was the chemokines associated with neutrophil recruitment, which makes sense in a situation where you have acute damage from leptiform discharges. I wondered if you could comment on that, because it's presenting a lot of cytokines, and we had this discussion about it, but maybe you can comment on the potential attraction to neutrophils.
Yeah. For sure, neutrophils were found also involved in some temporal lobe epilepsies and pharmacoresistant epilepsy. So for sure, there could be also an interaction in North, and something we could have a look also with maybe the single cell data in PBMC. Yeah.
Okay, now name of time, we're gonna have to go on, but we're gonna see if we can get some of the speakers to type in the answers to some of the questions. We just got another question or two on chat, so we'll try and do them in writing. That's good. Our next speaker will be Dr. Sookyong Koh, who is the Chief of Pediatric Neurology at University of Nebraska Medical Center. And she'll be talking about a murine model of Norse and fires.
Thank you. There were two seminal papers in 2018 under the leadership of and encouragement of Nora, Wong and Larry Hirsch. And this is, I think, when neurology community become very aware of Norse and fires as a separate entity. And here we are for the third year having luncheon. Thank you. I want to start with my talk on murine model of Norse and fires by starting with the definition that was actually published by that paper. The Norse was defined as a clinical presentation, not a specific diagnosis in a patient without active epilepsy or other pre-existing relevant neurological disorder with new onset of refractory status epilepticus. Now, fires requires prior febrile infection starting between 2 weeks and 24 hours prior to onset of refractory status epilepticus, with or without fever at onset of status epilepticus. And next shows the pictorially what fires in Norse looks like. So there will be super refractory status epilepticus during the active epileptic phase, then is followed by chronic epileptic phase. And it is accompanied by high mortality, neuropsychological impairment, loss of blood volume, cerebral atrophy is not uncommon, and followed by drug-resistant epilepsy with seizure clustering. So I have to think about these clinical features, thinking about developing murine model. And many years ago, this is an example showing that one of the wonderful pathology that we were able to get from one patient with fires, which unequivocally shown that yes, in the brain, there's this marked activation of microglia and also infiltration of peripheral T cells into the brain, and they are immunologically. So they mentioned this synergistic interplay, pathologic synergistic interplay between seizures and inflammation. And also, this is when a few years ago, I adopted the word Norse. So nuance said prolonged status epilepticus. And the reason why I thought the intrahippocampic acid could be animal model of Norse was this characteristic. It's been considered this IHKA was a temporal epilepsy model, but most often temporal epilepsy starts with status epilepticus followed by some latent period. It could be febrile in young children, febrile status epilepticus with a long latent period, and then seizure starts in adolescence. But in Norse, there's absolutely no latent period. So there's a rapid progressive onset of seizure and encephalopathy, evolving to prolonged suprarefractory status, and then drug-resistant epilepsy follows without latent period. And that's what we saw in our mouse model of intrahippocampic, where it is not only this microglia activation and astrocytic activation, but this seizures and recurrent unprovoked recurrent spontaneous seizures occurred few days after. We could actually monitor 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, and we saw many recurrent seizures. And in addition to microglia activation, we saw monocytic infiltration monitored after into hippocampal. This is what we call Christmas mouse, where the red is by the CCL2 positive T cells, monocytes, and the green is microglia. So you could see this infiltration of T cell and microglia activation after hippocampal. And then came this paper held by Chuck Howell, I wonder if he's here, showing that in a anakinra responsive virus patient, there's this intrinsic interleukin-1 receptor antagonist activity deficiency. So it wasn't really that they were not the lack of interleukin RA, but they're functionally deficient. And that really gave me a thought about what about mouse model? Is there such a mouse? All I had to do was go to Jackson lab. And there was this mouse that's interleukin-1 RA deficient. Nobody from epilepsy community have ever studied this. This was studied on rheumatoid arthritis, and they are more prone to immunologic condition. So the question we had was, do they have increased susceptibility to febrile seizures? And this is by injecting lipopolysaccharide with hypothermia. And another question was, do these interleukin-1 RA deficient mice experience worse seizures and glia activation after IHKA? And what I really wanted to do was to have a platform to test new therapy. If the interleukin-1 RA deficient mice with or without fever and with intrahippocampic, could it serve as a predictable platform to test new therapy? So I'd like to present to you today, hot off the press, some of these ones. So interleukin-1 RA deficient mice are more susceptible. You see in P15, regardless of whether you are mutant or regular wild type mice, over 80% will develop seizures to fever. But at P20, they're only the lupin mice who develop seizures, and neither wild type or interleukin-1 deficient mice who develop seizures at P25. They become resistant to febrile seizures. And when all the animals were compared, the threshold to have febrile seizure was lowered in lutein seizures, telling us that they are more susceptible to febrile seizures. Also, when they were subjected to IHKA, there were a lot more seizures per hour, more abundant epileptiform discharges, and more seizures in these deficient mice. On the top is just to show, yes, indeed, these mice are what they're supposed to be. There's a decrease in interleukin-1 immunoreactivity, an increase in interleukin-1 beta, and also NLRP3 inflammasome and CASP1 are increased in these mice. And they do have much more increased microglial activation and astrocytic activation. So there is actually increased mortality as well. And this is a very new finding. What we have is when I subjected this interleukin-1 mutant mice to the fever at P25, induced IHKA at P39, what I saw was this, what looks to me like subclinical status epilepticus at baseline, and there are more mortality associated with it. So this would be somewhat like a Fires model, where you have fever first, and hypothermia, LPS hypothermia is fever, and then intracranial hippocampal caning, causing this severe, very frequent seizures per hour. So we're detecting 25 seizures per hour in these mice. So to summarize, the new onset prolonged status epilepticus induced by intrahippocampal caning, and this animal develops spontaneous recurrent seizures without latent period. We have learned that vulnerability to Norse fires might be endowed by dysfunction of in endogenous interleukin-1 array. And this probably represents unopposed activation of inflammasome. And I'm using interleukin-1 array deficient mice who are more susceptible to seizures induced by fevers and interhippocampal caning, and it shows increased glia and inflammasome activation. And my feeling is that when we have a fever 1 week prior to IHKA in this mice, there is this high mortality and high seizure burden. And I'd like to suggest that this could be a promising neural model of Norse fires to serve as a platform, a trial of effective anti-seizure, low protective immunomodulated therapy beyond the steroid ketogenic diet in anakinra and Norse fires. And I would love to hear your thoughts. Any suggestion you would like to make about what drugs we should try on this possible neural model of Norse fires? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're open to questions.
I would love to hear any suggestion of anti-seizure medication that we could try on the model.
Come to the mic if you can.
Thank you so much. What's the question? How mice they die off?
Oh, they die of seizures. Some of them could be already somewhat low weight. So they don't tolerate this surgery itself. So they are fragile. Yeah. But you're thinking maybe SUDAP as a possibility, but it is definitely, they have incredibly high seizure burden. And they die like following day, for example. So we do the surgery for interhippocampal caning, and then we follow them. They survive the initial caning, but then they die a few days later.
Question about steroids or neurosteroids.
Yes, like a ganaxolone.
Just repeat the question.
So there's a question about whether we should try a steroid or neurosteroid for this mirror model. I think it's a good thought.
There you go. Next roundtable. Dr. Hafler, is that a new hand up or the old hand up? Oh, hold on, we have to unmute.
Sorry. Yeah, it's a new hand. But I mean, if it's really interesting looking, there looked to be a predominance of microglia. The microglia seem really increased after the I1 receptor knockout. Is that true? And I mean, have you thought about doing things like single cell of the microglia population in the mice to see what they're producing and with and without the I1 receptor knockout?
Yes, there was a market microactivation, and you're wondering whether we should be checking cytokines.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm against hypothesis-driven science. Why not just do single cell in the mice on, in the different conditions to see what cytokines are being made, then validate with antibodies and immunohistopathology.
Okay, it's a good thought.
Okay, we gave Dr. Koh things to keep her busy. All right, name of time, we're going to move on. I think, again, we'll get each speaker to address any typed in comments if we didn't get to them. So next we have Dr. Leah Blank. She's an adult attending epileptologist at Mount Sinai in New York City. And she's going to be talking more about Norse surveillance. She's there. With the point.
Okay. So thank you for inviting me to speak. And we're changing gears a little bit and talking about how we could maybe do Norse surveillance. So the idea is, as you all know in this room, that Norse is poorly understood, but we do know that refractory status is associated with high mortality and morbidity. And right now, there are no electronic medical record or administrative case definitions. And these kinds of definitions are really required to do population level studies. And population level studies are in turn important because that's how you know things about incidence and prevalence. It's how you can identify high-risk groups and even associated exposures or conditions, both geographic distribution and temporal distribution of cases. So our objective was really to try to do this, like, can we develop an EMR-based case definition? And then if we can we try to validate this in some institutions near us in New York City? And I'm going to be talking about the first one because it turns out it's tricky. So we use the Mount Sinai Health System, which is a large tertiary health system that covers a lot of Manhattan, and the catchment area includes New Jersey, and surrounding counties like Westchester and Long Island. We looked at patients that were admitted to an ICU, excluding the neonatal ICU, and we included any aged patient, and we were looking at the year 2019. And then you all are probably very familiar with these definitions, but for status, we use the standard status epilepticus definition, so convulsions for more than 5 minutes, or convulsions without a return to baseline in between, or seizures with impaired awareness lasting 10 minutes or more. And then we use the consensus definition of Norse. So again, you'd have to have status, plus you'd have to have been treated with at least 2 appropriately selected medications. You can't have had active epilepsy, and you can't have some obvious cause of your status epilepticus when you come in to the hospital. And so we did our chart review in sort of 2 different batches. So first we chose a random month of the year, which ended up being November, and looked at every single admission to an ICU or non-neonatal ICU in the Mount Sinai system to make sure that there were no cases of status epilepticus that didn't have a single code for either status, seizure, or epilepsy at any point in their admission. And then once we were satisfied that that didn't seem to be the case, we then reviewed all the remainder of the admissions for 2019, but only those that had a code for status epilepticus, seizure, or epilepsy at some point in that admission. We had a lot of help for chart reviewers, but every chart that was identified as status or Norse was then confirmed by 2 epileptologists. So then we took our chart review data and we linked it with structured EMR data by the unique encounter. And then we built a number of algorithms containing different combinations of diagnoses or procedures and medications to see if we could try to find a way to identify Norse patients. We calculated the sensitivity and specificity of these algorithms, also the negative and positive predictive values, and then the UDINS index, which can be helpful to say whether you think the test actually discriminates for your condition or not. So here are some of the results. There were about just under 14,000 ICU admissions in our system in 2019. We ended up reviewing about 1,800 charts, so about 550 from the month of November, and then another 1,300 for the remainder of the year. And then we identified 173 cases that we said were definitely status epilepticus, and 3 cases that we said were definitely Norse. And then we, tried all these different algorithms to see how well we could actually identify status or Norse cases. So these are the results for status epilepticus. And you can see that for status, it was like, okay, even just these are sort of the best performing by UDINS index. And just the ICD-10 codes for status epilepticus did pretty good. They have like a decent sensitivity, a pretty good specificity. The positive predictive value in our sample is okay. The negative predictive value is better. Adding like ventilation didn't seem to help much. Even adding like medications or, whether it's anesthesia medications or anesthetic drips didn't seem to do much. So we said, okay, well, we can kind of identify status. Let's see how we do with Norse. And so here are some of the Norse ones that we felt were the best. Again, so actually, we can capture the cases really well. So our best performing algorithm we thought was this one, which is like the ICD-10 coding for status, and then 2 or more anti-seizure medications. And this, of course, makes sense when you think about what the definition of Norse is, right? You basically have to have those 2 things. So we were able to capture all the cases with a good sensitivity, and the specificity actually is not bad, right? It's in the 90s, but because Norse is so rare, the positive predictive value is really not great. And then we said, well, are there other things we can add? So we tried, adding procedures. EEG didn't seem to help at all. And then we said, well, maybe if we add like an immunomodulator, and there you could up your specificity, right? So here it's 98% specific, but you start losing cases. So these translate, so that first algorithm just status epilepticus codes plus 2 anti-seizure medications administered. It takes your sort of 13,000 charts down to 157. And if you look through those 157, you will find your 3 Norse charts. And then if you look at that more specific one, which would be nicer, it takes that almost, for 14,000 charts down to 34 charts, but then you lose 1 Norse patient, which you really don't want to do in a rare disease. So what are we working on? We are trying to get that specificity up just a little bit more so that there'd be less chart review burden. Basically, we're trying some simple NLP that we think other large tertiary centers would be able to perform relatively easily so that this algorithm would still be transferable. And we're hoping that that gets the number of charts that you would need to review. If not to 30, then 50 seems like a reasonable number. And then when we're satisfied with the algorithm, we're going to work with our collaborators at Columbia, Cornell, and NYU to externally validate the model, and then try to calculate the incidence of Norse in Manhattan over the last few years, and so that we can get some temporal data as well. And then ideally, as I alluded to, we'd love for this to be shared with other tertiary centers so we can even get like broader geographic data. And so many people helped with this, and I am presenting on behalf of them. Thank you all.
Great, thank you. Let me ask one question. Is it possible, you basically found a way of identifying the refractory status fairly well, but then to make it Norse, you need to exclude the acute causes. So can you say, but not TBI code and not intracerebral hemorrhage code?
Yeah, so we did try looking at some of that, and they didn't get that much better. But yes, and maybe it's that we're not, maybe it's that we're not, maybe that we're trying too many codes or not enough codes. You never really, it's like us in the room typing in whatever when we're seeing patients, right, that are generating these. So you never really know how reliable they are. But yes, like we've looked at some exclusions, and I think that's like an important thing to think about how to up the specificity. I'd love more ideas. Yes.
Dr. Koh.
Just two quick questions. One was in your initial definition, you sort of started with, you mentioned no history of seizures in the past 10 years. But is that really, maybe I misunderstood? Is it even if you had seizures 10 or 15 years ago, it's kicked out of the idiopathic Norse category, doesn't it? And the other question was, we're using coding. You're going to try to do validation with other hospitals, but it seems to me there are regional and institution-specific coding habits or cultures that, we code something one way and all the residents do it that way, and that's what the coders see, and someone else the other side of town, it happens to use a different. There's so many codes, there's always 10 different ways you can do it. You run into trouble with that if you start to roll this out to a wider world.
Yes, so the first question, I can tell you that none of the 3 Norse cases that I adjudicated, none of them had any history of epilepsy, not even remotely. Definitely the coding, as I was alluding to before, is like, this is the problem with all of this kind of research, right? So I think like that's one of the reasons that we want, that's how we could get an NINDS in Manhattan, but also we want to be able to externally validate, say, in this health system that has different physicians, do these codes still work? I do think that at least the codes that are coming out as the top performing are like status codes, which I think are probably relatively similarly employed. They're not like, it's not like some special, like you have to put in a certain type of epilepsy plus this plus that. So I hope that they're more generalizable, but we'll find out.
Okay. So since you're not going to be able to diagnose Norse without EEG monitoring, it might be reasonable to start with the EEG, and then EEG patients in ICU will screen out a lot of the people that you don't want.
Yeah, so we did add like the EEG procedure code, and it actually didn't seem to change the characteristics.
Never started with it. We do a lot of those.
You mean like, I guess for the algorithm, like the way the sensitivity and specificity are calculated, it's agnostic to the order. And
Order won't matter to the algorithm. If you need both codes, you need both codes.
But I see what you're saying, but like,
Much smaller number of people will have EEG. That's the point.
Oh yeah, no, so I agree that starting out, maybe what we should have done in that November is said, okay, did any of these with status not get EEG monitoring? Which maybe would have reduced our fee burden. But I think that now going forward, again, sort of going back to Dr. Kohl's comment, procedure codes in ICD data are often or more heterogeneously coded for in like the way EPIC and other EMRs work is more idiosyncratic on the procedure side, at least is my understanding, than on the ICD entry, which is the like at least standardized in some way. So
I want last quick question.
We have great representation, but we don't have the blessing. We know low power status at that in all the hospitals, it's working really well. We should probably basically crossover coverage because of the issues what Andy said. The crossover validity of different sites. So it works very well in one setting. still doesn't look at the other side. It doesn't pick up the stars, so it picks up the care patterns surrounding that. But if you combine different algorithms in different centers, you might get better results.
Yeah, no, I would love that. And I would love to hear how you've simplified your NLP to make it accessible. Great,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to move on to the next section of the program, which is it's sort of a debate, but we had one person debate themselves because we didn't have time to have people do pro and con. So for each of the speakers, they were asked to give both the pro and con and fight it out with themselves. So there'll be 10-minute presentations and then 10 minutes for discussion. The first one will be, should cytokines be used to guide management? And it's going to be by Yi-Chen Lai, who is a pediatric intensivist from Baylor and has done some very interesting work in this area. Dr. Lai.
Just move with the arrows and point with the. Thank you. And first, I would like to thank Dr. Nora Wong and the Norse Institute for hosting the roundtable again. And I'd like to thank Dr. Larry Hirsch for an interesting challenge. But then I started thinking about it, and it turns out that we debate within ourselves all the time. As we're reading the articles, we sort of have to decide whether or not the articles support or refute one position versus the other. So in that vein, what I'm actually going to do, just to make things a little bit more interesting, is I'm going to use largely the same articles to argue for both points. So we'll say all that. Okay. Now, as we know, there is a whole bunch of dilemmas and problems in management of fires in Norse. And these are just one that sort of pops into my mind, right? We all know that Norse and fires are clinical presentations, which implies that there will be diverse etiologies, and that may sort of be associated with a diverse variety of illness and outcomes. And unfortunately, right now, when we sort of talk about response to a particular therapy, often we use seizure frequencies or the ability to, decrease anti-seizure medications, including the anesthetics, as a hallmark of response. But we all know that seizure frequencies can be influenced by how heavy you suppress them, right? And similarly, just because you can come off the anesthetic infusions doesn't mean that now the kid is not, or patient is not on, 20 plus anti-seizure medication plus a whole bunch of, non-pharmacologic interventions. And so really what we need, and we all know this, right? What we need is biomarkers for diagnosis, for risk stratification and prognostication, which we heard a little bit today. And, and for the clinicians is whether or not we can use a biomarker. We need some biomarkers to be able to monitor clinical conditions, right? Now, I'm going to do this very, very briefly, and I apologize for those of you who already know this. Generally speaking, immune response has the innate immunity side and adapted. And nowadays, the increased evidence is suggesting that, at least in fires, and seems to be now also in Norse, that the immune arm of the immunity seems to be the major focus. And I highlighted a couple of, I don't know why I moved this. So I highlighted a couple of cytokines, and these are the ones that frequently you will see in the articles and literatures, right? Now, I'm going to first take the pro position that cytokine profiles may be helpful in guiding management. And one is what I just talked about, which is different etiologies may have different inflammatory profiles, which kind of should be self-explanatory, right? And our problem right now is because we can't really, the Northern fires is still largely be a diagnosis of exclusions. And so often we sort of have to delay therapies vis-a-vis immune modulations until all other causes have been excluded, right? Now, the second part is if we're using immune modulators such as anakinra or tocilizumab, one would expect that you should expect to see changes in cytokine levels, at least, right? And like I said, we already heard today about maybe cytokine profiles could be associated with cell. So here, these are two articles one is from the adults and one is from children's. And all these are from CSF samples. So in the adult CSF samples, this is a proteomic studies. And using the principal components, the authors were able to show if you take up the N number in the adult study is 6 per subject groups. And what they were able to show is if they take the 3 subjects per group that has the most drastic protein changes, they can basically, segregate the cryptogenic Norse from Norse due to autoimmune encephalitis versus their non-seizure control patients. Okay, and what I'm not showing here is what they also found is the cryptogenic Norse seems to have protein changes in the innate immunity arms versus the autoimmune encephalitis in the adaptive immunity arms. And this is the articles from children with fires, and this is the hierarchical clustering. The point that I wanted to make here is they have different subject groups, and clearly you can see the clustering pattern is distinct, right? So that gives you a little bit of hope that in fact one may be able to separate the different group based on their immune profile. Now, this is the adult paper using the tocilizumab, and here it just simply comparing the Norse patients with their non-seizure controls, and as you can see, a lot of the cytokines are elevated in the Norse patients compared to the controls. Now, what about can you actually follow cytokine levels based as a surrogate marker for treatment response, right? And so this is the article that basically that's the case, I guess, the index case of use of anakinra, and embedded in that description is what I highlighted below, which is they found in the CSF cytokine elevation of IL-6 and IL-8 prior to anakinra, and normalized in after the anakinra in both. Now, these are CSF cytokine profiles of 4 patients from the children's with fire, and this is out of the intracerebral dexamethasone studies. And the red dots denotes the time when they were getting the intrathecal dexamethasone. And as you can see, generally speaking, there is a trend of a decreasing in cytokine levels in the patients. Okay, so this is the process. That's the process, which says you can sort of immunoprofile. You can do immunophenotyping. You can follow the treatment response. Okay, the con is as follows. There's really the little secret is there is really no standard for cytokine assays, right? Because a lot of us who are doing cytokine studies, they basically use laboratory-based assays. There are clinically available assays that you can send out, but the lab is, what we found out experientially is that it's hard to compare the result from one testing lab with the other ones. I'll show you that, in fact, different etiology may actually have overlapping cytokine profiles. And I don't know about you guys, but while those hierarchical and principal component looks very fancy and visually appealing, it's really not that practical when you are trying to take care of a patient at the bedside. Most of the times, I think you actually require a little statistical, a lot of statistical knowledge to be able to do that. And while, unless you're doing intrathecal administrations, getting serial CSF cytokine is really impractical. We couldn't even convince the parents to go through 2 or 3, spinal taps. And, can you imagine that if you're asking them that you need a weekly spinal tap? And so now your surrogate will be using the serum cytokines, but that is also fraught with a lot of problems because the serum cytokine can be influenced by your systemic conditions. So the same 2 studies that I showed you, remember the first time I told you was that they selected out 3 of each group that has the most changes in protein expressions. Now, if you include the entire cohort, then they're overlapping. Right. So it's now as clean as one would like to see. Now, for the one with the hierarchical clusterings, these are the values of individual cytokines. And you can see there is a lot of p-values, but all the p-values was between the FIRES patients and the controls. There is really no p-values as compared to the infectious, encephalitis and what have you. Now, while this is actually looks promising when they were able to measure, multiple cytokines, but which cytokine values do you follow? Because this is a dexamethasone, right? So which one of these changes, would you say that, the kid is actually responding? Supposedly, if we're using the anakinra or tocilizumab, hopefully it will be a little bit more targeted. But again, we run into the problem of what happens if your, CXCL9 is elevated, but your IL-6 is not. Does that mean that the kids are getting better, right? Or adult? Sorry, I'm a pediatrician, so I also use kids. Pardon me. All right. So this is something that's from our own data set. Here's the serial serum cytokine profiles of CELEBRA-IL-2 and IL-6. The black dotted line is the upper limit of normal for the assays that we're using, which is the clinical assays. And this one, anything above 0 is elevated, right? So if you look at this, you say, great, CELEBRA-IL-2 seems to be a target that we should go after. But when we sort of look at the serum cytokine levels in relation to a presence of infections, CELEBRA-IL-2 doesn't really look that good anymore, right? Because a lot of these elevation is related to a infectious episode. So that's not going to be helpful when you're trying to follow changes over time. Interesting enough, serum IL-6 and IL-10 seems to be elevated regardless of whether or not there is a presence of infection. So thanks to A.L. Muscal, one of our residents and pediatric rheumatologists, when we first started using anakinra, he suggested that we should follow serum CRP. And a lot of, back then we were like, well, it's kind of dirty marker. What does that mean? What are you going to do with it? But we did it anyhow. So we have a lot of serial data. And what you can see here is 2 different group of subjects. These are the ones that that was treated with anakinra that we were eventually able to wean off the anesthetic infusions, and on this side are the ones that we were unable to do so. And interestingly, maybe it's just it is likely an epiphenomena, but most of the kids who were able to wean off the anesthetic infusions eventually has a normalization of CRP values, whereas the ones that didn't get better seems to still have some persistent elevated CRPs. This is in the absence of known infections. So what do I take away from that? Well, I guess fortunately and unfortunately, cytokine studies are no longer just for research because now it's orderable. And in fact, full disclosure, at our institutions, this is actually one of the things that we routinely send out, which is a weekly cytokine profiles in the serum. The problem is, as I alluded to, really, they're not ready to be recommended as a sort of broadly to say we should use this for diagnosis, risk stratification of therapeutic decisions. But I do think that we basically need to start getting more information and learn how to do this. And this is mostly a call to arms, because a lot of times we're waiting for a definitive study to come out to tell us what to do, and we've been waiting for a while now, right? So, from a critical care physician standpoint, usually we're taught to do things first, and then you sort out what happens. Maybe that's not the right approach, but that's what we're doing now, which is we're basically as we're managing these patients, we're getting the serocytokine profile as part of the clinical practice. But we're not making therapeutic decision for it. We're basically just, right now we're just trying to learn how to manage. Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple of questions for you. One was about, do you think something about seizure control? I'm not sure if they meant whether to use that as a measure of progress and success of your treatment, or as a confounder for what the effect of seizures on all those on the cytokines.
Thank you. So that's an excellent question. We don't know. And the reason why we don't know is it can go, I think it's bidirectional, right? Because if your body is still inflamed, for the lack of better words, that itself could sort of lower the seizure threshold, which we all know, right? But we also know that seizure can propagate. It can sort of induce an inflammatory process. So the answer is we don't know, but it doesn't, if you're using it more as a monitoring, it may not matter as much, because you track them, and if the inflammation marker gets better, one would expect that the seizure should be better, regardless of which one is driving.
Cool.
I anticipate my question, but I'm confused. Are the cytokines, is the argument here that the cytokine changes are specific to Norse, and are they causal, or are they simply consequent? The one control group that I haven't seen, and maybe you have this, is status of known cause, post-traumatic, vascular, whatever. This is clearly not Norse, but it's still a lot of seizures. Have you looked at that group to see how they compare the differences?
Thank you. So, yeah, so that's,
we can have,
yeah.
That compares all the patients with non-proper pathology and patients with other form of respiratory status. And we found that all the cytokines involved in innate immunity were higher in patients with non compared to patients with respiratory status. So what is the etiology?
there was another comment in the chat about whether we should be using gene expression profiles rather than cytokines. Not exactly within your debate, but you want to comment on that, or maybe I should have somebody else.
No, you can. So who wanted to take the gene expression lines? I don't have any strong opinion on that one, but we're basically just seeing genetic study as a part of the practice anyhow. The question is, can you but usually it takes about 3 weeks, as you all know, so it's not going to be as helpful for the clinicians who's managing the kid at the best or patient at the best.
I mean, I would just say, Larry, the correlation between gene expression and cytokine secretion is actually not terribly good. They give very different bits of information, the experimental question, but there's an incredibly poor correlation between the two. We see that over and over again. But when you look at RNA, you're looking at what the cells are actually making, and particularly at the single cell level.
That was in Zoom. Okay. Yeah, we're running 1 minute behind, which is pretty darn good. So thank you, Dr. Lai, for debating yourself. Okay, our next self-debate is Ronny Wickström will be talking about, are we ready for clinical trials? So Ronny Wickström, as everyone knows, led our big Delphi consensus statements as the head of child neurology at his hospital at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. So welcome, Ronny.
Thank you very much.
Is that the point?
All right. Thanks. Thanks to organizers for inviting me and giving me a chance to win the debate for once. That's very, so I'm gonna give you, so there's not much data, of course, to base this debate on, but I'm gonna give you some background and then some personal thoughts on this, and maybe we can give a lot of time for the discussion because I'm really anxious to hear what your thoughts are. Maybe that way. So we can go back a couple of years just to recap a little bit. We had this discussion on this roundtable meeting 3 years ago in Baltimore, and there were ended up with a couple of questions that we wanted to address. And the first three of these in this picture is whether combining ages and etiologies would be good or negative for interpretation of data. Second one was whether we had enough consensus to establish a treatment algorithm. And the third one concerning whether the present algorithms for workup and treatment were appropriate. Now, these three, we answered no to them, or yes, no, no. And then that's what actually led up to the consensus papers that were published previously this year, performed by a lot of people in this room, actually. So we actually addressed those questions, answered those questions. The remaining three questions concerned treatment trials. And the first one of these was what kind of treatment trial is likely to be most effective for the Norse virus group? And for a pilot study of active drugs, is there consensus on what drugs or what drug to study, and or at least to study first? And then the important question of outcome variables, how do we measure an effect? And again, looking at the consensus paper, for those of you who are involved or have read it, as you may remember, the fifth part of this concerned research and registries. And just to go through this, what we concluded in the consensus paper was the first two questions was a full consensus concerning the necessity for running multi-center international efforts and to develop an international web-based high-quality clinical registry and a database, and that should be prioritized. And we had some thoughts on how to achieve this, to perform a joint registration of clinical data and to open a biobank. And this is in many ways what's been is up and running right now. And of course, we have both the Norse Biorepository at Yale and also the family registry. Now, the following questions there concern, or the statements rather, concern clinical trials. And we reached consensus on these four statements saying that an interventional trial of immunological treatment should be initiated, and that it was complicated finding a design of the study, so that alternative study designs are needed. It's always easy to say without specifying what this alternative is. And then we actually reached consensus, although there was a lot of debate on this, that we should try to perform a head-to-head randomized comparison between two selected interventions, and that if doing so, the prioritized treatments should be interleukin-1 receptor antagonists and interleukin-6 antagonists. And as you can see, the level of agreement there was lower, although we did reach statistical or consensus. But there were a lot of concerns, you can see below, for several reasons concerning both the choice of what to study and also how it will be difficult to study things. And of course, at the bottom there, the fact that we won't be able to have any controls and we don't have any, and may not have sufficiently good historical data will make it very hard to interpret data and to discriminate from no effect or less inferiority. We also discussed some possible study designs. And one would, of course, be to run regular comparative effectiveness research in one way or another. There are several alternatives. We discussed adaptive outcome designs and the problem of trying to compare to standard care. We don't know what standard care is. We also discussed having treatment plans, see in the third place there, having a set number, a couple of possible alternatives that could be chosen from the clinical team, which would, of course, introduce a bias and a non-randomization, but also would increase the autonomy and perhaps the compliance or the willingness to be part of this kind of studies. And at the end, also, we discussed biomarker like we were just discussing now. And we did a vote here. And if you remember, this were the results from the vote last time. And the one that the group perceived as most feasible was number 3, having treatment plans. As you can see there. Another question, if I can just pop down here, concerned whether we should combine adult and pediatric patients. And there was actually a majority advocating that we should not have them in the same group. But so if we go up and look at these questions that we had, actually the final question, the number 6, is actually we have initiated that, and under the lead of Hiba Haider, I believe is sitting here. There you are, Hiba. This has been initiated actually. So there is work going forward in trying to develop common data elements, and this has been escalated to the ILAE to have their support in trying to define common data elements, including outcome variables. So this is also moving forward. And the next step, of course, would be to develop a clinical database in biobank and make it larger and working. And this is on the work as well. And then to proceed to try to develop a research consortium, I think. So going back to the question then, are we ready for clinical trials in Norse? On the yes side, I'd say that it is important and in many ways the logical next step. There has been substantial progress made in reaching that objective. And we do have a foundation sitting in many cases in this room for establishing an international research consortium that can actually do this. And there's been, since we published these papers and since last year's meeting, there's a great interest and willingness to participate in this. On the no side, however, we still don't have any consensus on an appropriate study design. Actually, we don't even have a suggestion on what that kind of study design would be that would be acceptable to everyone. And I fear that if we let the perfect be the enemy of the good, we're going to be standing here in 5 years not having gotten much further in this case. So we need to think about what can we do. And then, of course, the lack of funding, but that's more of a technical thing to try to solve. So the reasons against are, I wrote here that they're technical and logistical challenges. They're actually more than that. We need to find a way to start our studies. I'm hoping that we'll run a head-to-head clinical trial soon, but I think this soon is not going to be in the next year or two. I think it'll be in quite many years, actually. So I think we should try to optimize the observational studies that we have that are up and running and try to make them really good so that we can advance the field as we go along in waiting for these head-to-head trials. So the things I hope we can discuss here for some time now is these items. One is the formation of a formal research consortium, how we actually do this. And we discussed clinical research or design, possible designs of trials last year. We haven't really proceeded in how to do that. And in order to do it, I think we need to try to have an idea on how to work with this. We really need to work with trying to design that kind of study. And of course, we need to get together as a group and find funding for this. Concerning observational studies, I think we have an observational study that is up and running, and we should just try to increase the enrollment in that state. And I would also suggest something I suggested just briefly last year, try to develop a clinical decision support unit that could be combined with the CRF. And I think this is an interesting thing. And the suggestion, I don't know if anyone knows of something working like this, but my idea would be something like this. So this would be machine learning in its simplest form, I guess. Basically, what the system would do is you put in all the data we know, all the current evidence of what we know, how to treat Norse and fires. And then as an individual, can I point to this? Can you see? No, you can't. Okay. You can't. So what you do then, this would serve as like a knowledge database. And what you do is as an individual, when you have a patient, you introduce it into this online clinical decision support unit that will give you and take your baseline characteristics of your patient and give you a suggestion for an individualized recommendation for both workup and treatment. And regardless of what you do, if you follow these suggestions or not, then you put in the data what the results were. And then you just keep on doing this. And in the end, you enter the outcome. So the two good things about this, one, you as a clinician, you'll get up-to-date recommendations on how to do this. And the unit will learn. So by machine learning, you'll have updated. So every time you put in that I gave steroids, didn't work, it'll learn. So steroids apparently don't work. So it'll be a real-time updated thing. The other thing is that so for you as a clinician, getting access to the clinical support system would be your initiative or your incentive to put your data in. But this will also link directly to the database. So we'll get all the patients and the biobank in the database. And this should be such an easy thing to do. If it was to work, then people have to use it, of course, otherwise it won't be worth anything. But I think this is something that should be useful. So that's basically it. And I would like to hear if there are, the one question, the most important question for us is what are the obstacles? Why are we not getting it? What do we need to do to get the clinical trials running that we want?
Okay, thanks. We're open for questions. Come up to the mic. Also, is there anyone doing that kind of clinical decision support where it actually makes clinical recommendations and doing research with it? Do you know of anyone?
I don't.
Does anybody know of anyone doing them? Just wondering about the implications of having some program or thing that actually recommends treatment for patients. I could see in the US that being tricky.
We discussed that, yeah, absolutely, the legal part of that. So that has to be solved, of course. But you could also argue that that's exactly the same thing you do with any recommendations. And these would be recommendations. The thing is, of course, if you have a system that learns, you need to audit the system somehow. So it's not learning the wrong thing and giving the wrong kind of recommendations. Because this is basically what we do in a prospective study. We enroll patients, and then after 3 or 5 years, we look at what it said, and then we publish a paper and say, these are the results. This would be in real time, rather. We can't, I agree that somehow we need to do.
If you get consent and all, that's probably fine, yeah.
I hate to be contrarian, but
No, you don't.
no, it is. So I was highly involved in designing the first ever randomized clinical trial in treatment for refractory status, the stage trial. And as you all know, the phase 3 trial failed, and there are some reasons for that I could speculate about. It was an incredibly Herculean task to do that and to identify patients. To take a disease like Norse, a subset of highly refractory status patients, with an incidence of 100th perhaps and there were some Norse patients in the stage trial actually, with an incidence at the 100th or so, 2 orders of magnitude less than refractory status in general, and design an adequately powered study would be extraordinarily difficult. So one of the fundamental decisions, I think, is whether there's enough evidence to say that mechanistically this disease is somehow different than other refractory status situations, or conclude that we may not be smart enough to understand this disease, but fundamentally the treatment itself either is not the same in any refractory status situation. So that would influence our willingness to jump into a very novel approach. The last point I want to make is I can't see a way that you could do a non-randomized trial and draw a meaningful conclusion. But what you could do, which may have been part of the challenge of the stage trial, was have delayed treatments pathway, so that everyone will ultimately get treatment, but there might be a 7-day offset, which is something that from an ethical point of view might be more tolerable than either you get it or you don't. I think actually that option in the stage trial contributed to the failure of the trial, in that the declaration of failure opened the window to get open label treatments. And there may have been some subtle motivation to say, sure, this is really better. Kind of want my patient to get the drug. I'm going to call this EEG a failure. And then we'll get open have skewed the results in that trial. So, if all, we did not anticipate. But I think you got to deal with randomization, and you got to decide whether there's something so unique about this illness that it would open itself to a specific class of agents that wouldn't be relevant in other status situations. Because if it is relevant and cross status more broadly, then it's much easier to get a trial. Not easy, but it's easier to get a trial.
Yeah, thanks. No, I mean, I agree. I fully agree. The question of whether Norse is different from refractory status epilepticus as a whole is, of course, a key issue, and one I guess isn't resolved. And you can look at it from different ways. There are studies indicating that the immunological component of Norse appears to be very large, and maybe larger than other groups. And whether that's as a group or whether it's not true, I guess we don't really know. But of course, increasing a study to include all refractory status epilepticus, that would of course increase inclusion, patients available for inclusion. Question is if you're diluting the immunological cases, that would be, and I fully agree that a randomized trial is the way to go. I'm just thinking that we're not going to be there in many years. And we heard yesterday discussing the ketogenic diet and where we are, and it's going to take so long for us to have the evidence to be able to both get it ethically approved and then have everyone have, I use the term compliance, maybe that's not the right word, but have people actually and wanting to enter their patient into the study. And I don't think we're there yet. So I'm just basically advocating that we don't wait until we have data for a clinical trial. We need to do something else. Clinical trial could be something else than a head-to-head randomized trial.
Great presentation. In the medicine, randomized profiles with the standard of finding out what's right and wrong. Unfortunately, and it doesn't finally endorse every decision point that they ask me on that Norse spectrum. And there's 80 questions that we put in those papers. So investigating every single one of them with a randomized profile, I don't know if it's feasible. It's probably not going to be paid for. So the solution we saw, we showed research about 10 years ago was the comparative effectiveness approach. Two pieces need to be in place, I think, for you getting there. One is basically you have good input variables. You can't stand on shifting grounds with regards to the data that you enter. And with some of the additions, some of the case report forms have not been validated, but we don't have an entry form yet. There is one in progress, but that needs to be probably relatively clear and campaign. The other aspect is that then you can run not a randomized trial, but potentially pragmatic trials. The approach that you're suggesting has been validated in other areas of status, early areas of status. We're looking into stopping seizures before they start, this mirroring justice, for example, or seizure detection. And there, what you could do is you could hide the results of the system and just have people continue clinical practice and then look at the variation. The learning healthcare system or the research system that you propose is coming into the past muster by most of the approval agencies, and it's going to be difficult to implement because the clinicians still are going to choose clinical care. But I think you can do it in batches. And I think the whole system that you propose, the whole pathway is very ambitious. You have to start with initially with the clinical data elements, for the definition of those, as well as then the first pass, which could be a clinical effectiveness assessment, learning from variability of care, and then building based on that input of the learning system.
Yeah, those are good thoughts. Thanks.
I don't know whether or not I mentioned this to some of them before. One of the things it comes back in mind is the children of college. So their model is very unique and actually has some highly successful in that they want these children with cancers, right? And it's a high risk and high kind of a high risk worse scenario. So what they would have to is a group of institutions who basically take priority when their children and we stratified the chance. So when the children meet criteria, these are the options. And the way they basically then do their sort of technical effectiveness and efficacy after some number of patients who are enrolled, then they look at the data and see whether or not there's any sort of essentially they refine it. Right? So it's similar to a scenario that is not really fun. And sometimes so when they and they're consenting we should clinical study, but really the alternative is basically whatever standard of care. And so we basically have to follow clinical standard of care. So in the case of basically you want to start with cytokine value as a standard of care versus a immunologic. I think the trick was is whether or not as a community we have already lost a lot of us actually anything. So the agreement is that we're going to use source of this there's an ethic now, and we actually get an outside, which is actually what we're going to do. Actually, there is no data to show that amount.
Yeah.
We had Beth Wells. Can she unmute?
Can you hear me now? Sorry. How's that?
Good.
Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, I'll try one more time. Ronny, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, good. Thanks. I apologize for that. Actually, my comment was kind of a follow-up to the last one, coming at it from the world of pediatric brain tumors and neuro-oncology, where many of our trials are taking what we think is just the very best treatment and adding something exciting onto it. So I'm thinking about our consensus guidelines, and we're already saying, to do IVIG, to do anakinra, and so maybe it's what's the next step, the salvage therapy, the JAK inhibitor or something else. But I think it's a great group, and I'd love to be a part of a trial. Because I think that really is the best way to get the best care to most kids and adults.
Make any comment?
Yeah.
They're not working.
Has to be here. Okay. Thanks, Beth. Fully agree. You're running.
Yeah, so we're kind of into the next section, which is totally fine because it's just open discussion. But if any, I just want to give people a chance to bring up any area of research to see if there's anything that we haven't brought up at all that people think is worth studying. I guess you heard a little bit about intrathecal steroids mentioned. That's something that's become a little more popular, and for example, but if people have other ideas, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I'm Seah from New Zealand, and so completely understood what you're saying, but also very disappointed that this pediatric bias patient I've got in front of me, several years and finding a new treatment. I guess in other areas of dire need, they're trying neuroprotectants like extending or something that is going to be the solution or the definitive immunotherapy, but would be an extra carrot for enrollment in a clinical trial. We get all the data that we can capture and implement all the protocols that you've already outlined with the standard of care and excellent care. And I'd love to move forward with something simple like that. Really just see something that's not going to be the game changer, but wouldn't be harmful. And yeah, just hope we have to wait 3 or 4 years for a little bit more hope.
No, I agree.
All right, any other comments, questions? Living on Zoom land? If not, we will feel free to put stuff in the chat as well, and we'll try and get to them And you'll see a lot of, I think people have noticed in the chat that a lot of the responses look like they're coming from Nora Wong, but she's been handing her computer to the prior speaker to answer all of them. So they're all coming from the prior speakers. Okay. Henry, you have a quick question or comment? Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. Regarding the prior topic, we base a lot of our treatments on at least this early decisions on treatments on the EEG and how EEG changes. Yet the interpretation of EEG is extraordinarily diverse. And while we talk about different consensus pathways of treating, we actually have not aligned on how we look at the weans and success of weans, and really bedside successes on in acute setting. It would be nice to see some sort of a strong consensus coming out of these bodies and prior to trial design to really level the playing field of what we're defining acute successes, because without acute successes, the long-term outcomes will be tainted by continued infusions.
So you want the ACNS terminology even longer, is what you're saying. No, I totally agree. That's very important in the studies. And yeah, I know you were part of it, but the SAGE trial did a great job of doing that. So maybe we can start with that and do some more general publication on defining endpoints. Good point. Okay. Get back to the main. So actually was a nice segue about the different possible ways of doing studies and the funding issue. So we're very lucky to have Vicky Whittemore, the program director from NINDS, and NIH is going to talk to us about NIH funding mechanisms. And Vicky's been very helpful over the years to not only to the Norse community, but to every clinical epilepsy researcher. So thanks so much for being here, Vicky.
Okay, thanks. Well, thank you, Larry and Nora, for inviting me to be here today. And what I'm going to try to do is just give you an overview of potential funding mechanisms. And what I've heard today is a lot of really great ideas that could come in as grant applications. And I'll come back at the end, I think, to what you were just talking about in terms of funding for clinical trials. So at NINDS, we have 3 divisions. We have the Division of Neuroscience, which I'm in. I'm a program director in the Channels, Synapses, and Circuits cluster, where we oversee grants on epilepsy and basic neuroscience grants. And we see in the epilepsy portfolios, we have everything from basic to translational to clinical studies. Then there's the Division of Translational Research, which is the division that takes the grants the next step. So once you have findings in basic science that you want to move forward toward clinical implementation, I can say that word, that goes to the Division of Translational Research. And there's also ways to do biomarker studies, assay development, animal model characterization, leading to using that animal model for potential preclinical studies of compounds, potential compounds or treatments. So there's lots of different options there. And then finally, the Division of Clinical Research is the division that oversees clinical studies, but also the clinical trials. So I just put this up here to show you that at NIH, we fund grants all the way from individuals who are pre-bac, so undergraduate students, primarily through institutional grants, not individual grants. But then we have grant mechanisms for graduate students and medical students and fellows, postdoctoral students, early career development awards, which are by and large K awards that are meant for clinical fellows or clinical research. And then moving into the more
established awards like the R Research Project Awards, everything from very small grants where you need to just get a piece of work done. Those are $50,000 a year for 2 years, and I just need to do this piece of work before I can do the next grant, to R21s, which are very much more exploratory, where you want to characterize an animal model or develop take a project a little further to get preliminary data that would then allow you to come in for an R01 grant. So the R21 is typically a 2-year grant, and the R01s are then typically 5-year grants. So again, I just kind of lay this out here. These are the basic science funding opportunities. And most of these grants, as I said, would fall within the division of neuroscience. And one of the newer initiative is that you might want to think about is an interdisciplinary team science grant. It's an RM1. And the idea here was to encourage interdisciplinary teams to come together to really address a really significant, important issue. So we've had what we called program projects for quite some time, and in a program project, you are required to have essentially 3 independent projects that are synergistic, that all are related, say, on the same disease or same mechanism or same theme, and some research cores, but they're really independent projects that all come together. In this situation, for the RM1 or the team science grant, you have multidisciplinary investigators who come together to address one focused question, and your outcome that you really want to make a transformative change and move the field forward in that area. So you're all working together on that. So it's not, again, like one investigator takes specific aim 1, another specific aim 2. That's not the idea. The idea is that to answer specific aim 1, you need a team of people to do that, and likewise for the other specific aims. So we just had our first round of this. We had 160 teams that we talked to. Not that many applications that came in, about half, I think about 80 applications came in, and we're in the process of review of those applications now. An important thing to think about is diversity. At NIH, we're very interested in expanding the diversity of the research workforce. And so many of our grant mechanisms have a diversity component as well as the so-called regular grant mechanism. And the idea being that we really want individuals from diverse backgrounds to have a leg up in review, and we typically have a higher pay line, so fund more grants in those areas. So we have a new R01 mechanisms that is open to any topics within neuroscience, and this is being supported by National Institute of Drug Abuse, National Institutes of Mental Health, and NINDS to support new or early stage investigators who are really wanting to move their research forward. So I list here all of the different funding mechanisms within the translational division. And this really covers everything from biomarker development and validation to development of small molecules, moving them all the way to first in humans, device studies, grants that focus on use of devices in epilepsy, and gene therapy mechanisms. And again, this is everything from individual investigators to teams of investigators to the small business and small business tech transfer. So small business grants coming in from small businesses, the STTR grants are partnerships between a small business and academia. But all of these mechanisms, I'm happy to talk, I could talk for an hour about all of these, but I won't. So, but if anyone has anything in particular that they might be interested, you know, I'm happy to talk to anyone about any of these mechanisms. And then moving on to clinical trials, I realize I left one off here as I heard people speaking, but NeuroNext is a infrastructure NIS and NINDS put in place. There are several institutions across the United States that are ready to run clinical trials. So if there's an idea for a clinical trial, investigator comes into NINDS with that idea. And you can come in and utilize the NeuroNext sites as well as bring your own sites into that. If there's a site that is critical to completing that clinical trial that isn't part of the network, that's okay too. There's exploratory clinical trials, which are very early stage clinical trials to prepare you to have the information to move forward then to a phase 3 clinical trial. Many of the clinical trials come in just through our regular R01 grant mechanism, which is a 5-year grant. And a lot of times these grants come in as R research grants and get converted to what we call U grants. And what that allows is just a lot more involvement and oversight of NINDS program staff to help you through that process of completing that study. And the one I forgot here that I think Toby mentioned was the comparative effectiveness studies. So we have a specific grant mechanism that allows for funding to do head-to-head comparisons. And what I'll say is that listening to the conversation that you were just having, my suggestion would be to put together a group of people and we can work to arrange a discussion with our folks in our Division of Clinical Research. Because I think talking to them at this point and saying, here's where we're at, here's where we'd like to be, here's what we kind of need to put in place. How could we design a clinical trial? Because we're very open to different designs, not the standard placebo-controlled, blinded, randomized phase 3 study. So I think it would really be worthwhile. I'm a basic neuroscientist and I'd be interested in listening to the conversation, but our clinical folks in the Division of Clinical Research, I think could be really helpful in helping you just think through where you're at and what might be a path forward. So you're not waiting 5 years to get to a clinical trial, that you could move that forward in a much more rapid way. There is a process that we go through for any grant that's requesting more than $500,000 a year, which most clinical trials are going to be cost a lot of money. So there's a pre-proposal process that you go through by submitting a pre-proposal, and then it's really quite iterative with a team of NINDS program officers, so that when it goes to our leadership for proposal, just to ask if you can submit the full application, you've really worked through and thought through a lot of the problems before it comes into NIH and goes to grant review. So my last words of advice are contact a program director. So there are several of us epilepsy program directors at NINDS. My colleague Ben Chern, who was here, I think just must have had to leave. I just saw him leave the room. Really covers the more basic science grants on status epilepticus. Adam Hartman is a pediatric neurologist, epileptologist in our Division of Clinical Research, who I work very closely with on clinical studies and clinical trials. And then I also cover a lot of grants on basic mechanism, basic and translational and clinical studies in the epilepsies. So contact any one of us or contact me and I can direct you. But again, I would really encourage you to think about just putting together a group for a conversation. I think it would be potentially really helpful to solidify where you're at and what needs to be put in place to be able to move forward with a clinical trial. And we're happy to do that. And I'm back to the agenda. So I'll stop there and see if anyone has any questions.
So Vicky, you mentioned the NeuroNext program, and I was wondering, does that program encompass trials of acute nature? Because I know that there's neurological treatment trial network at the University of Michigan, but the Norse, how those two programs would view a trial for acute emergency.
So there's a different network, the Siren network, that handles those types of more emergency, that is supported also by NINDS and NHLBI in a very similar manner with sites across the country. I don't know as much about that, but that more emergency care network exists.
And that would be for status epilepticus?
Could be, yes.
And could you repeat the name?
Siren, S-I-R-E-N.
That's NHLBI.
and NINDS. It's co-run by those two institutes.
I think that's that and the NETT, I think you're referring to, but those are more for emergency room based ones. But I think for refractory status where they're already admitted, or at least neurology is highly involved, I think these other networks are probably more appropriate, but not positive.
Has NeuroMeds ever
been involved on a trial like that side? I mean, patients out of emergency room that perhaps still want to keep their son, but or
Not that I'm aware of, but I would have to look into that. I don't think so.
Thank you very much. And we will close with our fearless leader who's going to make a few comments. That's Nora Wong, of course. Nora? Yeah.
Nora Wong, Norse Institute. I want to thank all of our presenters for sharing their hot off the press work. It's very, very generous of you. And then also for Vicky to give insights to this very complex process. For those of you who want to be involved in that conversation, please email me and I'll make a list. I wanted to just let you know that it's our aim at the Norse Institute that we continue this collaborative interdisciplinary conversation beyond these 2 hours. I mean, it was our goal to get all of you in this room together and for you to question, share, and possibly collaborate with each other outside. I want to let you know about some of the other projects we have that we did not highlight today. Krista Eschbach is leading an international working group of long-term outcomes, which includes families and patients. Sarah Hawker is interested in exploring the model of centers of excellence for Norse. And I will be gathering a group of doctors and families, patients, to work on recommendations for communication in when considering transition to comfort care in the ICU. I encourage you to look at our website. We have a lot of resources there. And one of the things that we offer to your patients is we have sympathetic listeners. They're a select group of family volunteers who will just be available to your families who are going through the throes of acute Norse. And we have family Zoom calls with patients and families to support each other and share advice. So thank you everyone for your work on Norse. Thank you for coming.